Unbroken, the podcast with Marilyn Black. Healing through storytelling.
Hello and welcome to Unbroken, the podcast with me, Marilyn Black. I am speaking to inspirational people that I've met from all over the globe, actually, and today we're going to Canada, and we will be speaking to Marnie Grundman. Marnie has been featured on over 100 major television and radio shows in Canada, United States and Europe, including a TEDx, Breakfast TV, Global TV, CP24 News, The Marilyn Denis Show, Young Justice, Here and Now CBC, News Talk 1010, CJAD, and the National Association of Adult Survivors of Child Abuse. A child who belonged to no one, missing at the age of 13, she spent years living on the streets where she experienced the worst of humanity firsthand. In her darkest hours, while living in an apartment complex sauna, she was sure that everyone who knew her had forgotten that she even existed. It was in those desperate hours that she decided she was paying upfront for a better life than that lay ahead. What began as a story of healing led to one of triumph, of the power of the human spirit, of one woman's surthrival against all odds. Marnie has since become an advocate for the missing, working to change the perception of runaway children so they might finally get the help they desperately need. While her number one mission is to break the stereotypes related to runaways and people who experience homelessness, she also speaks on a variety of topics designed to motivate people to reach beyond the stars. Welcome, Marnie. So lovely to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. The first question that I ask everyone who comes on, because the show is called Unbroken, is what does the word unbroken mean to you?
Wow, I hadn't thought of that. What does the word unbroken mean to me? Well, I guess it means whole, which is what I am. So yeah, that's what unbroken means to me. It means whole. It means not damaged, more importantly. And for children who grow up under the circumstances that I did, we're taught that we're damaged. And it takes a while to get to a place where you are unbroken, for sure. Yeah.
So I have read your book, Missing, the true story of your childhood. And the way that you were treated to, spoken to, made to feel as a young person, it's really hard as a mum, to hear that somebody could treat their child like that. Can you take us back to what life was like before you did run away at 13? Well, that wasn't the first time you ran away anyway.
No, and just for people to understand that when a child runs away and finally really hits the streets the way that I did, and you end up living there, you have a series of, for lack of a better word, practice runs. And they're based on the triggers, the things that are happening in your life. People think that kids are running away because they're being belligerent. I started running away when I was around 5-6 years old because my mother dropped me out of a 2-story window.
I broke both of your arms.
Both of my arms were broken in the fall, and then I ended up living with my grandparents, and that was a house of tremendous dysfunction and sexual abuse. My grandmother was a functional alcoholic, unfortunately. So it never really, nothing ever was safe enough to be able to be in an environment that I wasn't running away from in those two places. And so for me, just every day I didn't know, right? I didn't know if this was going to be a day that was kind of peaceful and, ordinary by normal standards, or if it was going to be a day like with my mother where my closet was going to be strewn on the floor and I would be called every name in the book and terrorized. And on those days, within a few days after that, I would run again.
What was shocking to read is that I assume most people think that young people that run away come from a broken home, they're in poverty. But you had a very privileged lifestyle. Your mum was you went to boarding school, you come from a middle-class family, there was money. People don't make that connection.
And actually, that is the norm. And one of the reasons that so many children from a household that's middle to upper class run away and don't end up getting the services that other children might call attention to is because we come from a nice house, and it's like a pretty person. Our reaction naturally to something or someone that's more attractive is positive, and so we tend not to really think that there's anything not good beneath the surface, right? So when you're a child growing up in a house that looks very nice, everybody's well clothed, everyone's clean, everyone's fed, the assumption is that you're just a spoiled child and you don't appreciate what you have. When really, if you look beneath the surface, abuse doesn't check whether or not there's, I always say, whether there's a nice car in the driveway. Yeah. Dysfunction doesn't check itself at the door because you live in a nice house. Dysfunction and abuse is it's handed down through generations. Mental health is something that affects every single person on the planet. And as a child who was running from a household like that, it gave my mother the ability to really paint me as this spoiled bad kid. If you looked beneath the surface, you would have seen a child that was liked by her peers, her teachers, did well in school. And this was actually the only red flag, the only thing that I was doing that was a call for help, not attention, but for help. And so for law enforcement and people who are conditioned to dealing with children who are coming from impoverished homes and environments where the abuse is also different because they may not be eating because there's no money, things like that. They're not as equipped to deal with it because by human nature standards, they don't look beneath the surface or don't do it well.
Yeah, they tend to label the child rather than actually what's going on in the home. If your home was really a safe, good place to live, why would you want to run away? That it would take a lot for you to think living on the street is going to be better than living in my home.
Well, what I always say, my kind of tagline is, what would make you leave your home where you have a bed and 3 meals a day and a bathroom and just all the creature comforts to live on the street somewhere? What would make you actually do that and stay there, not go back home? And that's tremendous, and especially for a young person.
So you were 13 years old and you had many practice runs, as you call them, and reading your book, that urge to run seems to be hard to keep that feeling down. At 13, you made that choice to leave your unsafe home and live on the streets.
Yeah.
What was that like as a 13?
Well, choice is a funny word because I made that action.
Yes, okay. That
decision implies that I knew what was waiting on the other side, right? And as a child, we barely know what's waiting an hour later for us, right? We're not developed enough to think, oh, okay, A equals B. We're just learning it. So certainly I had no idea what was waiting on the other side, but once that switch flipped, I was treated with so little value by my mother that I really believed that once I left, nobody would be looking for me. Nobody would even blink that I was gone, and that people were better off without me.
Mm-hmm. And she didn't come looking, did she?
Not really. She didn't file a police report. I came to learn later. She made it seem like she was really looking and doing certain things. The truth was that my brother and the boy that I had been with in boarding school, they were looking for me. There were people looking, but my mother, I believe that my mother was kind of enjoying the attention of being the victim in the scenario, which is, pretty common. Borderline personality disorder, narcissism, it's always about them no matter what.
Yeah, the drama of it all.
The drama of it all. And to be fair to her, she was raised by my grandparents. I lived with them for 5 years, and who knows what their home environments were. This came from somewhere. And it took me a long time to figure out it wasn't about me. I just happened to be the child she had. It wouldn't have mattered what child it was, right? Because she suffers with mental health issues.
And that's great that you can look outside and see the bigger picture and not take it personal, because it impacted on you so personal. So it's a bit of a paradox. It's not personal, but it affected you so personally. So try and tell us what it was like living on the streets as a young teenager.
Well, I think I did most of it pretty numbly, which I had learned when you're a child of abuse, you learn how to numb out, imaginary world and things like that. But oftentimes it was violent. I was sexually assaulted.
There was a man in his early 20s, wasn't there, who offered to take you somewhere for some food, and yet he took you somewhere else and raped you.
And that was the first one. That was when I ran away when I was 12 and it didn't stick.
Mm.
And I never told anyone. I carried that with me for probably until I was like 26 or so. And it was a really long time before I even realized that I had been raped, that I hadn't chosen that action. Even though I was 12, I didn't even know what like virginity meant. I was so...
You didn't have the language for it.
I didn't have the language for it. I didn't understand what had happened, but I was sure it was my fault because everything was always my fault, right? And then when I was more permanently on the streets, I mean, just the days without food and water or any sort of shelter at all was pretty tough. I would say the worst thing was the loneliness and the isolation. People walk by you like you're not even there.
And that was the hard part, wasn't it? That how we treat people on the streets, how we don't make eye contact, how we just ignore them, that we think they're less than. And you're a 13-year-old girl, really, in my mind, a baby on the street. Nobody noticed, apart from the guy in the 7-Eleven did take some care of you, but even then his boss said she's, causing trouble. Yeah.
By my presence, right? And this is what, 30 some odd years ago, 40 years ago, 40 years ago. Oh my goodness. Let's go with 30. But even now, I mean, all those stigmas, we're getting better. Social media, I find, really helps with that. There fortunately is an upside to social media, but even now, we still have the stigmas. We still have the natural tendency not to understand that it's better to make eye contact and give some human contact and validate that somebody is worth at least a smile from you. That smile you give that day might have been the difference between a person even taking their own life and not, because they felt worthy in that 1 second. And the way that people still stigmatize kids who are running away is just a runaway. A runaway is a missing child. A runaway is the most endangered child because of the fact that they're the ones who need love and care, that are desperate for anything that resembles love and care, and predators capitalize on that.
Yeah, you're very vulnerable when you're out, but you did meet some good people, and you met one woman, which I just thanked that she came into your life. She was really an angel, wasn't she?
Yeah, she's my guardian angel without a question. And it goes to show you that the people with the least very often give the most.
Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Sorry, of course. I love talking about her. I wish I knew what happened to her. She was, unbeknownst to me at the time, not that it would have made a difference, but she was a prostitute. And she found me on a park bench and she asked me if I was hungry. And she took me in for a couple of days. And in those couple of days, she asked me if I knew what she did. And I had no idea, even though I had sat outside her apartment all day waiting to come back in the evening and watched men coming and going. That's how young I was, right? And she said, well, I sell my body. And she said, I sell my body because I do drugs. And she said, or maybe I do drugs because I sell my body. It's been so long, I can't remember anymore. And she made me promise to go home. And with my fingers crossed behind my back, I nodded my head yes. She made me speak. It was the first time in 2 days I hadn't spoken because I was afraid she wouldn't like me. I was embarrassed of my situation. And I promised myself that I would not do drugs and I would not sell my body no matter what happened. As a result of that, I feel that's how I came out so whole, because I didn't fall into drugs and I did end up being trafficked, but I didn't end up selling my body. And those two chunks that weren't taken away from my soul made a huge difference in being able to get through those year and a half on the actual streets and the subsequent year and a half of being a teen on my own.
Yeah, she really just showed you, I guess, what love and nurturing looked like.
unconditional,
Yeah.
nothing in return, and really wanted to save me from her fate.
Yeah.
And isn't that what we all strive to do? It's funny that the survivors or surthrivors of such horrific things, then we're the ones who are trying to save the world, because we're still trying to save ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to me, and I'm grateful for the path that I'm on and to be able to do that now.
Mm-hmm. So what really happened after you parted ways with her?
A lot of street time. A lot of street
You
time.
went from job to job and you met different people along the way, and you kind of made friends with a young woman along the way that you kind of stuck together through thick and thin, really, didn't you?
Yeah, she kind of was like my street family, which is a term I only learned in the last couple of years through volunteering.
It was
And
a very tight connection though, wasn't it?
we were in the same boat, and she had been out on the streets quite a bit longer than I had. She's a couple of years older than me. I've come to learn she's 10 years older than me. I unfortunately, I found her and found that she had passed away. But she, she taught me to sleep in apartment complex saunas. She taught me to steal food off of, the grocery shelves, and most of the time not get caught. She taught me that we could, I survived because of her, no doubt about it. I mean, this was in the cocaine cowboy era in Miami. We lived in cocaine houses. And the benefit of living in a cocaine house was that the men really didn't have an interest in sex because they were doing coke.
They couldn't get it up anyway.
No. So she taught me to navigate the streets in a completely different way that took me off a park bench and at least put me in some shelter. And eventually I started to fall into jobs. I lost touch with her. Some of it gets a bit foggy because of the fact that I don't have a good hold on chronology, and I think that's the trauma.
Yeah.
But at one point in time, we both got arrested. I think it was for the breaking and entering, where we were sleeping in a house we shouldn't have been in, and we became separated, and I couldn't find her again. So I ended up falling into a job eventually as a cocktail waitress at 14 and a half, 15 years old. Got my first apartment, and I became self-sufficient. I didn't become.
But you say it so like, you just flippantly say it, I became self-sufficient. You're 14 and a half, you're working in a cocktail bar, you have your own flat. My girls would phone me at 40, Mum, how do I do this? It's unbelievably, and it's not even mature. I don't have the words for it. It's a huge responsibility as such young shoulders.
It's survival, though. You learn this is better than that, right? It's survival. The downside to have been a teenager in that situation, the tremendous downside is, even though I had a roof over my head, that didn't always mean I had, oftentimes I didn't have food still. Yeah. And it was a choice between, do I pay rent or do I buy a sandwich? I mean, quite literally, down to those sorts of nickels and dimes. But the bigger problem was I was still very much prey. I was still sexually assaulted and finding myself in precarious situations because I still had this big stamp across here that said, I'm a very young person and I'm easy pickings, right? So it didn't bring me to the kind of safety that it implies. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that, because even when a kid does manage to get them off the streets, we need guidance, right?
They're still very vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. I mean, that's when I was trafficked for labor, because I fell into a job that ended up that they were human traffickers. And I didn't know it for years that that's actually what had happened to me, until I look back and realized, I was on the streets working countless hours, not getting paid, sometimes not getting fed, with other kids stuffed into a hotel room. And, I had a roof over my head. I wasn't homeless, but I was still being victimized.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It was complete cheap child slavery, really, wasn't it? When I read those chapters, like, what? What is going on?
No, and I'm walking into businesses and I'm selling a product. And I mean, when I was 14, 15, I looked 10. a really tiny person, right? So there's no way you could have actually believed me when I said I was 18. It's impossible. The bars I worked in, thankfully, they let me get away with it, with the exception of one. And he wanted special favors in exchange for, unless I had ID. And I quit that job. I ran, it was awful. At every step of the way, there's somebody who wants to take advantage of a child. And unfortunately, you're not where you're supposed to be. And intellectually, you're not developed enough or strong enough or believe enough in yourself in the power of the word no. That takes a long time to learn, right?
Yeah, I guess it's the confidence, isn't it, and the belief, but it's also the experience. How could you know what to do at 14, 15, 13?
Yeah.
You're not worldly. I mean,
Learn what to do.
this grew you, but not in the way that you would normally, I guess, mature.
Yeah. I lost everything, right? When kids are going to dances and in high school, and children like me, like, you lose everything. You don't get any of those normal rites of passage where you skin your knees in an environment where you're protected. You're just constantly skinning your knees and trying to fix them yourself.
And do you regret that you didn't have those childhood memories?
Oh, very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was really nice to be a mom. I am a mom, but it was.
And what was beautiful about your book was the very start, the letters from your children. It was like, so it's clearly so proud of you. So proud. And you're not just a mum, you're a grandma.
I am a grandma, and I'm actually laughing now because one of my grandsons is 14, and he's going through that I'm gonna do what I want to do phase. And my daughter's calling me going, what do I do? And I'm like, take his door off the hinges.
So you became a mum at a young age, really, didn't you?
I became a mum at a very young age, and
that's when you went home, wasn't it? When you were pregnant.
It was after I had my eldest daughter, because social services then reported me back home.
She was tiny, wasn't she? She was just a few weeks old or something.
Yeah, she was 10 days old when I ended up having to go back to my relatives. I call family the people that are good in my life, and my relatives are just people that I have blood with, right? And I was 17 years old. I had a 10-day-old baby. I'm flying via Miami to Montreal because my family lives in Miami and Montreal, my relatives. And I was, with the exception of one aunt, why did you leave? How could you do that to everyone? Didn't you know what you put us through? Nobody asked me what I went through except for the one aunt. And she didn't really ask me. She was trying to get me into counseling and keep me from my mother's clutches, but it didn't work. And so that was, I came home to be re-victimized all over again.
Yeah, because she then just accused you of what she always said you would become.
Yeah, exactly. And until I met my ex-husband, I believed that everything that happened was 100% my fault. And he said to me, he goes, do you not understand that most 13-year-olds don't end up living on the streets and running away from home? Like, your mother made this happen. This is not your fault. And it was through him that I ended up in therapy. And it was also having my kids. When you see your child at an age that you were doing certain things or certain things happening to you, you kind of go, oh my gosh, I wouldn't let that happen to my baby. That's my baby, so it really, it was very healing in that respect. And it also, I hate to say I lived through them a little bit, but I did, being able to see them go to dances and join theater or pursue whatever interest they had. That was giving back to myself too.
So you've become a very contrastingly different mum to what you had.
Oh yeah. Not perfect.
She's taught you how not to be.
Yeah, it was like, I always say it was like every day was like living an opposite day. And that's not to say what was part of when I was in therapy as well was I could feel some of my mother's anger and instincts. I didn't act on them, but I didn't have, my only roadmap was so emotionally violent and at times physically violent that it becomes an instinct. And I think it's important for somebody to know that and be able to own that and be even released by that, because it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It means that you need help coping and you need a better skill set. And I did.
It just shows you where the work is that you need to do, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But a lot of people, they won't break the cycle that way because they don't want to talk about, you know, that they're feeling really angry and that maybe they're going to scream at their child that day or whatever it is. They're, you know, I can see where it didn't happen with me because I had a support system at that time, but I can see where it's very difficult to, you know, stick your hand up and say, I need help with my emotions and with being a better parent. So yes, I broke the cycles and there were a lot of things I didn't do, but had I had a better roadmap, I just think I would have done that much better. And I'm fortunate that, you know, my kids are close and they're wonderful. And we had a very open communication growing up. But I want people to know it was not an easy thing, that there were times I was fighting against the other mother that lived inside of me. Because I don't want someone to feel like, you know, if they're maybe feeling like they're falling short, that it should be easy. It wasn't easy. None of it was easy.
No, it's constantly pushing inside, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, you know, as I said at the start, I was amazed how it's your instinct to run. So I'm wondering, is that instinct still there? Is that something you'll always have, or is that gone now?
The best thing you can do for yourself is to accept that certain things will never be gone. Okay. And that way you can deal with them better, I think. That will never be gone. That is a talking process in my head. Like if I'm having discord with someone, even though I may not physically run anymore, I finally stopped doing that. Emotionally, I will shut down, which is another form of running. It's insulation, right? And that's not a healthy coping mechanism.
No, but it's you devised that coping mechanism with the skills that you had at the time, didn't you? So from a very immature mind, you devised those coping, but that stayed with you. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it's a constant training, like not as bad as it used to be, because like anything, you know, things become habit through practice. But I didn't realize how much I was doing it for many, many years. Like it was kind of like a last piece of, okay, I got to stop, you know, going back to 14-year-old me that just bolts. Because it's very unfair to the people in your life, right? And it's unfair to yourself because people don't read minds. They just see you maybe being cold and then they feel rejected, and it creates a cycle that isn't going to solve the problems.
Yeah, there's all these unspoken signals and energy that you're giving out.
Yeah.
And what is great now, though, is that you obviously have great awareness. You've obviously done a lot of work on yourself, and you can see where the work still lies or where you get caught. But at the end of the book, really, I love your word, surthrival. It's a fantastic word. What it came down to, though, your happiness, it was your choice.
Yeah. And it is our choice, and every day it is. And, you know, some days you fall a little short, you know, you might get stuck in a funk, but our minds are so powerful. I look back at the 13, 14-year-old, I was sleeping in a sauna, and I convinced myself, it makes me sad now because it shouldn't be, but I convinced myself that I was going through what I was going through for a better life ahead. And nobody should have to pay for a better life ahead, which is the part that makes me sad now. But the part that I embrace so much is that was my way of pushing through and grabbing onto something good. And it just shows you that you can do that and you can survive anything and everything. But you really have to be mentally strong. And you have to catch yourself when you're going down, you know, the funnel there into the drain and go, oh, let me catch myself here, and pick yourself back up. And some days are easier than others. You know, some days are a little woe is me for a minute, and finding something to do to shift yourself.
But it's good, you know, because obviously you are resilient, but people think you just get that resilience, but you're being very real when you show us that actually sometimes it's 2 steps forward and then a step back. It's not always straightforward. You know, healing isn't a straight line. It's not linear, but.
And it's lifetime. Healing is lifetime. And that's okay, you know, because it's never as bad as it was the day before, right? I always say, no matter what, my mindset thing, my biggest strength comes from, like, if I'm going into a little pity party for something else that's happened, it might not even be a memory or a trigger. I'll go, hold on a minute. Are you homeless anymore? Like I kick my own tush, you know what I mean? Are you homeless anymore? No, what are you complaining about? Kind of thing, right? So when you remember those reference points where you were at your lowest and how far you've come, that'll snap you out pretty quickly, or it does for me. But it's there. You know, triggers are still there. I don't like to sit in a restaurant and have people behind me. I'm uncomfortable, so I don't.
What does that do to you if people sit behind you?
It's the activity. I feel unsafe. I feel anxious, and I'm also, perhaps because of my time on the streets, I'm hypersensitive to my environment anyway. I have a remarkable memory. I could go to a restaurant this morning and probably tell you how many people were sitting there and what they were wearing, kind of thing.
You check everything out.
Checking everything out. So definitely people behind me feeling that is difficult for me. It just gives me a bit of anxiety. I intellectually understand that I'm in a good, safe place. I'm just in a restaurant, but my body still remembers bad things happening from people running up behind you, perhaps, you know? So your body holds a lot of trauma and memory.
It does. The body absolutely remembers. But now you've made it your life's work, really, haven't you, to speak out about what we call runaways, young homeless people, to break the stereotypes, to bring some understanding, some compassion. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
So a lot of what I do, other than speaking like I am with you right now, to share my personal stories so that people are able to connect to the fact that I'm a human being just like anybody else, and I happen to grow up on the streets. A lot of what I do focuses on prevention and supporting organizations that either heal or prevent or both. One of the organizations I work with is Covenant House. I think they're up to 38 homes now, and not including the ones that specialize in human trafficking. And I raise awareness for them because they go into the schools, they go to first responders, and they educate in looking to prevent kids from ending up on the streets in the first place. And then they house the kids and in a way that they give them a home. A lot of people just say, well, there's enough shelters. There could be 1 million shelters. It doesn't mean that people are accessing services through shelters. Shelters are a bed and a meal. That isn't healing. That's not a long-term solution. So a lot of what I do is I educate as to why the kids are running in the first place, the dangers that they're facing. They're the first ones that are going to be trafficked, and not the majority of the time for sex. For example, the first 2 to 48 hours on the streets, a child will be approached by someone who wants to exploit them, either for, you know, money or for their own gratification. Understanding that we are responsible as a society for permanently housing these children and taking them in as their own is extremely important. They are our future. They didn't ask to be where they are. They deserve better. And they're human beings. And so what I work to do is close the gap, close the gap between, oh, this is a belligerent child who's just running away, and making people really understand that, look at yourself at 12 or 13 years old. What would have happened to you? And we need to be more sensitive and focus a great deal on prevention. So everything I do is geared towards that. And a byproduct of that is sensitivity for people experiencing homelessness in general. Understanding that walking by is the worst thing that you could do to another human being. There's many times I don't have change, like I run out or I don't have gift cards because I like to give food gift cards, but I will never walk by someone and not say anything. I will at minimum say, listen, I'm really sorry, I don't have any change.
But I do think that you are in a minority. I think people, because I'm a patron for a Scottish organisation which supports young women that are homeless due to sexual abuse. And, you know, they're peed on, they're kicked, they're ignored, they're spat on, they're sworn at. There's so many awful things happen to them before they go on the street, and then when they get on the street. It's just, why is it so hard for people to be compassionate or understanding?
I
Judgments.
I think that sometimes people are, you know, they want that separation so that they feel like they'll never end up there. When in fact, especially with adults that become homeless outside of domestic abuse, it's usually a catastrophe that creates homelessness. It's not just running out of money. I know a professor from McGill who one day gets a knock on his door. His children and wife were killed in a car accident. This man who'd been married for 30 years lost it, ended up homeless. You know, people don't end up homeless just because they ran out of money. It could happen to anyone.
Thinking of that man.
It could happen to anyone. And even if you don't think it could happen to you, you still need to like grow some compassion and understand that talking to a homeless person isn't going to make you a homeless person, or a person experiencing homelessness, I should say, because you know, it's a label. One of the things that I've learned about what I do is that even if I only touch one person, that person touches one person.
Yes.
The ripple effect. And I've learned to stop being frustrated because of that. And people share stories with me. I had one lady, she saw my TEDx and she reached out to me and she said, because of you, on my way to work every day, I feed at least one person and I ask them what they want to eat and I go get them food. And then a month or so went by and she sent me another note. She goes, hey, everyone in my office is now doing the same thing.
And I have to tell people to go out and watch your TEDx. It is amazing. It really is. For you to stand there and share your story, because you obviously, not the image that people assume they look at you, which is what part of your talk as well. So you're breaking the stereotypes. So before we end up, I just want you to maybe part some of your tips, you know, for anyone that's listening. What would you say?
I'm going to speak to the people who are survivors of trauma. I mean, to me, that's what I've spoken to. The people we're educating enough, hopefully. And what I want to say is, don't be so hard on yourself. You're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days, but the bad days are not going to swallow you up. You already survived the worst, and you're standing and you're strong enough to make it through anything else that comes your way.
That is a beautiful message to finish on. So all it's left for me to do is to thank you so much for joining me today on Unbroken, the podcast. Thanks, Marnie.
Unbroken,
Thank you.
the podcast, with Marilyn Black, playing now on all the main platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher for Android, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and here. Play Unbroken, the podcast, with Marilyn Black.